Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, February 4th, 2022, and today we're going to be taking a look at an electoral map in 2024, if Joe Biden is to recover in terms of his national approval rating. Now, the reason why I'm doing this is because I've made a bunch of videos showing Joe Biden against potential contenders in 2024, such as Senator Ted Cruz, Governor Ron DeSantis, and former President Donald Trump. And I've seen some comments asking about the possibility that Joe Biden does win in 2024, counting on the fact that there is some type of rebound in terms of his approval. And my plain answer is that yes, it is entirely possible for the approval rating to rebound, and we'll talk about circumstances in which that has occurred, including the former president Donald Trump, in which his approval rating actually rebounded from some low points where he was experiencing the lowest point of his presidency. Now, taking a look at our 2024 map, it looks different than our 2020 electoral map, meaning if we were to apply the same exact map to 2024, you would actually find that Joe Biden gets 3 less electoral votes simply based on the fact that reapportionment has changed around the area of some of our electoral votes. Now, the map here is at 306 to 232 for Donald Trump, but in terms of where it is right now, my most recent projection actually shows Joe Biden losing to Donald Trump in a future type of matchup. That's because Joe Biden is falling out of favor when it comes down to the national approval rating, and things don't seem like they're going to be getting better anytime soon. But that doesn't mean that it is impossible, and I've seen some people say that Joe Biden is just 100% screwed for being reelected. I think that when looking at the historical precedent, the precedent has been set for a long time that presidents typically win reelection. And even those who haven't won re-election, what you will find is that all of these, most of them, were in the 1800s. Beyond that, you only have just a very few amount of presidents in modern political history. The last time a president wasn't re-elected was in 1933, before you started to hit the Ford, Carter, Bush, Trump era. And that's only really modern political history. Taking a look at our long-standing national history, what you will find is that almost every single time a president decides to run for re-election, they end up winning. And sometimes they return, in the case of Grover Cleveland, who lost re-election but actually ended up going on to win 4 years after that election. So, in taking a look at Joe Biden's approval rating, what do we exactly mean by rebound? What does this mean for the sake of our, video that we're talking about right now? Well, what this would do is essentially take the approval rating and hover it above the disapproval rating, somewhere similar to where it was right at the point where it was falling off. Right at a point where Joe Biden may be approved of somewhere around 52% and disapproved with 43%. Because looking at some of the early honeymoon phases, it doesn't really make sense to expect Joe Biden at any point to rebound, being up plus 20 nationwide, but somewhere being up about 7 to 8 to 9 points definitely is believable, especially considering he's down by 11 points at this point in time. We have seen some pretty considerable flips. This one is nearly a full flip of where it was just a year ago, but there's something to be said that a year from now, it is entirely possible that that does change. And if you want to talk about historical examples, we could bring up Donald Trump, but I think the better person to bring up is President Barack Obama, who had a 2-term presidency, where you can find that for short periods of time in the long run, that he was disapproved of. Going into the 2010 midterms, what you found was that Barack Obama was falling out of public favor. At one point, he was disapproved of by a margin of 7 points across the nation, and that was something that was a bit of a warning sign for Democrats. They were saying that this might actually end up with Barack Obama losing in 2012, and then things began to get worse. In 2011, the approval rating got to a very low point. At one point, 10% more of the nation disapproved of Barack Obama than approved of him just a year out until the 2012 election. But then, through a very carefully orchestrated campaign event and intentional strategy, the Democratic coalition and Obama's campaign was able to rebound that approval. And by the time we reached Election Day, what you found was that Obama, instead of being down 10 points a year prior, was actually up about 2 to 3 points, and eventually on Election Day came to a point where he was approved of by 3 percentage points nationwide. And then it rebounded again. After Barack Obama was reelected, there was no real need for Democrats to be approved of besides the midterm elections, and they really didn't get it. At one point, Barack Obama was disapproved of by 16 points more of the nation than he was approved of, and yet by the time he finished his presidency, well, get this, he was approved of by 18 points more than he was disapproved of. People began to love him, then hated him, then loved him again, then hated him again, and then began to love him again. It is very interesting to see how the approval rating definitely has fluctuated, and it is very clear as Obama is a perfect example of how the numbers can change. So let's go ahead and get into this election prediction about what might happen if Joe Biden was to be at least, back to where he was right before that disapproval rating overtook the approval rating. First things first, that we would characterize all of the safe Democratic and Republican states. I don't think this is too much to comprehend. I think many of these states we already know how they're going to go. There isn't really going to be any type of competitive nature to states like New York or Massachusetts or Connecticut. And for the Republicans, they also have some pretty good states to lock down. What you have is North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Idaho. Kansas is iffy. We'll get back to that one. Actually, I want to talk about that a little bit more in depth. Oklahoma definitely makes sense. Nebraska at large makes sense. The 1st district makes sense. And the 3rd district makes sense. There is, I think, a singular district in Nebraska or Nebraska at large that was narrowed up slightly, but we will see what happens. I don't think that it will be the case in 2024. Moving on, what you will find is that many of these states are considered to be safe. Utah makes sense, Tennessee makes sense, Kentucky makes sense, West Virginia definitely makes sense. A lot of these states, I don't think there needs to be any type of explanation for it. Alabama definitely as well. The iffy thing about South Carolina, Missouri, and Indiana is that there's a possibility that they do narrow up into the likely column in 2024, especially if Joe Biden is to recover in approval. But considering that he was up about 7 points on Election Day in 2020 and they still weren't able to become likely states, I'm less confident that they would in 2024 unless there was some type of shift in population like we're seeing in Montana, which we aren't necessarily seeing in Missouri or the state of Indiana. So looking at the map here, what we find is that the Republicans are at 103, whichever Republican nominee is going to be, and then 180 for Joe Biden. I think that, looking at our map right now, we are looking at a significant portion of the electorate already decided, and that's just the way that American politics is. Regardless of how Joe Biden was approved of or how he is today or this potential approval rating that we're working with, many of these states really wouldn't change much. The only, few states, maybe Oregon, Washington might narrow down to 14 points instead of a 16 to 17 point victory, and same thing in some states in the Northeast, but beyond that, many of these states wouldn't change, and the point is that all of these states would end up with the same exact victor at the end of the day if this map was to be held today or, in a year from now if Joe Biden has recovered at that point in time. So 255 quote-unquote toss-up electoral votes, we're working in an environment where every single state matters. Now, the thing about our map is that it isn't just safe or toss-up. We have some states that we generally know how they're going to go, but we can't be confident enough that there's going to be a 15-point plus victory in some of these states. Those are states such as Montana, where we know how it's going to go electorally. We know Republicans are going to win there, but we don't know exactly if they're going to win by 13 or by 16. And for right now, I would say that if Joe Biden was to recover, considering that the state is undergoing a small increase in population and that also would just be some type of, internal benefit for the Democrats having the incumbency status, because it is a big thing, as I've shown you in years past, looking at the amount of presidents who have just won re-election. What you will find is that the state of Montana could very well narrow down into the likely column, but you're right on the edge of a 13, 14-point victory for Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis, whatever Republican nominee ends up in this position, and that's just how it is. Moving beyond that, I think the same can be said for Kansas, which actually was in the likely column in 2020. Same thing was South Carolina and Alaska. Those states ended up in that column as well. I think that regardless of how Joe Biden's approval rating ends up, the states of Iowa and Ohio are going to be very difficult to win. What you will also find is states such as Texas are also going to be very difficult to win. Not impossible, but definitely something that will be challenging. Looking at Maine's 2nd congressional district, that's a Republican district there. Looks like it's going to end up staying that way in 2024, but that leaves us with a total of, true toss-ups at 232 at least. Every single one of these states in the true toss-up column or districts were competitive in 2012, 2016, or 2020, and that's why we're dealing with them right now. But that's a significant portion of the electorate, and I've already characterized many of the likely Republican states. I don't know if I'm completely finalized yet, but we will take it, and play it by ear as we go through some of these states. But for the Democrats, they definitely have some states we can characterize as likely. States such as Colorado or states such as New Mexico or Virginia definitely will rebound to being likely states for Joe Biden. I think the same can be said for New Hampshire and Minnesota. Keep in mind, when you are the incumbent president, you have that under your wing. Maine at large would be likely, Maine's 1st district would be safe, and that brings Joe Biden to 225 electoral votes, and the Republicans at 126. Looking at some of these states, what I think you will find is that the margins will marginally increase for Joe Biden and the Democrats, considering our current environment. I think that, we are in a position where many of these states are going to be extremely close, but could see some minor improvements for either party depending on the approval rating right now. I think there will be some substantial flips relative to 2020 if Joe Biden was to hold the election today, if there was to be a presidential election today, simply because Joe Biden won many of those swing states by narrow margins. Joe Biden won by narrower margins than Donald Trump did in many of those swing states, so it's not as if there are some pretty solid red states some pretty big swing states that were on the cusp of going blue. I mean, at most what you have is, North Carolina, you have Florida, and beyond that, I don't believe any of the states that Donald Trump won in the quote-unquote toss-up column were won by single digits. Sorry, not single digits, by less than 5%. But let's go ahead and continue through. Joe Biden at 225 is definitely a good look for the Democratic Party, and I would also say that Michigan I would expect to move over into the likely Democratic column. While there is a narrow loss of support for Democrats as people tend to move out of the cities, Detroit, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, there also is something to be said about the fact that Democrats would expand what they did in 2020, and that was win the white electorate, which is an extremely important part of the states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Also, I do want to say that if Joe Biden was to recover, keep in mind that being approved of as an incumbent is a much bigger deal than it is as a candidate. When Joe Biden was up 7 points, that was how much people actually favored him, and your favorability rating is almost always, and is for Joe Biden, higher than your approval rating is, or should be. Same thing with Donald Trump. And, looking at the election results, Donald Trump wasn't approved of in 2020. He wasn't approved of in 2016 either. But what you found was that the fact is that despite him not being disapproved of, he wasn't blown out in the margins. What you found was that Donald Trump came within 44,000 votes of winning the presidency. Approval rating matters, but only to a certain extent. It is not the end of the deal. It's not the end of the road for a candidate. If they're disapproved of, automatically they're going to lose. But what I do think that you are going to find is that there will be some improvements for either candidate depending on the incumbent's approval rating. And if Joe Biden is approved of, that just simply matters a lot more than his favorability rating that we remember from 2020. So putting it at this point, the Republicans are at 126 and Joe Biden is at 240. He is going to have some type of increase in support. Nebraska's 2nd District, I also think, would go back into the likely Democratic column. As for some of these other states, one thing that I do want to say is that at this point, I wouldn't expect much from the Democrats in the remaining states in terms of large margins. At most, I would say is that maybe Nevada could go into the likely Democratic column, but for the rest of them, I would still caution against making them, significantly more Democratic. And that brings us at 247, which means that a bunch of these states remaining will need to go, further into development and discussion about how they're going to go. One big state that I do want to get out of the way is the state of Texas, in which I think the Republicans would win by a lean margin. You see, taking a look at the electoral history of the state of Texas, what you will find is that between elections, Texas has gotten bluer. Relative to 2016, relative to 2012, relative to 2008, 2004, 2000. The only time it actually got a little bit redder was from 1996 when Bill Clinton came within a significant portion of potentially winning the state, and it also got redder from 1992. But then you compare it to 88, you compare it to 84, what you will find is that the only real time in which there's a substantial Republican increase in the vote share is from 1976, when there was actually some substantial victory in many of these states for the Democratic Party. So looking at the, relative to where it was starting off in the 21st century, Texas has consistently shifted further and further to the left, and I see 2024 with a Joe Biden rebound in approval being no different. But moving beyond, I also would say that the state of Florida would go to the GOP by a potentially a lean margin, a tilt margin. I think a tilt might be slightly more appropriate. The thing is that Florida, while always in reach for the Democratic Party, is somehow just so far out of reach. At this point in time, I would say, because Donald Trump did win here by 3.3%, a rebound in approval wouldn't be enough to actually win the state. I think it's possible that it does end up narrowing down to a tilt margin, but I do think that there would be a Republican victory here, especially if the GOP nominates someone like Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis. I think that could really prop them up in the state. While I am not talking about candidate, electability and individuality in many of these states, or really on the broader sense, because it is just a generic Republican that we're facing this up against, I do want to say that the state of Florida definitely has taken some strides in favor of the GOP and has shifted a little bit further to the right relative to the last election, and did from 2016 to 2020. Moving beyond those states, though, I would say that the states of Wisconsin and Pennsylvania would go right back to where they were in 2020. That shouldn't really shock many people. I would also say that the states of Georgia and Arizona would become lean states. Now, it might be weird to see Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Georgia all share the same characterization. My reasoning being that Wisconsin and Pennsylvania are going to see a minor decrease in Democratic vote share, but still an uptick in terms of vote share because of the approval rating rebounding and maintaining their incumbency status and popularity. Arizona and Georgia have just been growing, pretty dramatically in terms of Democratic vote share, in terms of population altogether, and that definitely needs to be something acknowledged and should be acknowledged in this prediction. And it is, two states that ended up defying expectations and shifting dramatically from the right compared to Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, which actually only shifted by about 2 to 3 percentage points, whereas Arizona shifted by 4, Georgia shifted by over 5. And the final 3 states that I need to characterize, I think, could be fairly obvious about how they're going to go. I would say the state of Iowa becomes likely, but the state of Ohio becomes lean. This is something that's more of a hunch. I think that Ohio definitely could become more competitive without Donald Trump being on the ballot, but that is a contingency thing. I think Iowa just might be a little bit too far to go. Ohio recently elected a Democrat to the United States Senate. Iowa did not, and I think there is something to be said about that there. Anyways, moving beyond those 2 states, the state of North Carolina, I would narrowly give to the Democrats. And I mean, we're talking about an Obama type of victory, 14,000 votes out of 4 million cast type of victory. Wouldn't be, the largest margin by any metric. It definitely could go to the GOP. I could be entirely wrong about that, but that's why it's in the tilt column and in a pretty narrow circumstance. So the final map here would be Joe Biden at 319 electoral votes to the Republicans 219. Not some super type of landslide or super large margin of victory, but it is one nonetheless, and it is a 100 electoral vote advantage over the GOP in this final map. The only state that flips relative to where it was in 2020 is the state of North Carolina, and it is a pretty resounding victory for Joe Biden, considering that right now he's disapproved of by about 11 points nationwide. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.